MIT 1939. A freshman walks into a physics lecture with a blank notebook. While 200 students frantically copy equations from the blackboard, he writes nothing. Each pen stays kept. Each is track the professor's chalk, but each hand remains still. Later, in each's dorm room at 3 часа ночи, he opens that same notebook. For the next 3 hours, he reads and structures the entire lecture from memory, but not as nodes. As equations, he did himself. By graduation, he have 47 of these notebooks. They don't contain a cent-grow capit formula. 26 years later, you see this same method to win the Nobel Prize. The reason WH destroys everything you know about learning. Richard Feynman's notebooks aren't normal. They contain no highlighted passages, no copied textbook solutions, no bullet-pointed summaries from lectures. Instead, they were filled with crossed-out MPTs, failed returns, dead ends, and eventual breakthroughs. Evidence of a mind not absorbing information, but building it from scratch. While each classmates treated their notebooks as storage devices for other people's thoughts, Feynman treated each as battlegrounds where ideas fought for survival. The difference seems subtle. Copy versus reconstruct, passive versus active. But the difference created a chasm between temporary familiarity and permanent mastery. The reason WH change is everything about how you learn. Schools taught one method, Feynman discovered another. And the second method, brutal, slow, frustrating, is what they never told you about genres. The education system has a profitably lie at its core. Knowledge is something you receive. Attend the lecture, read the textbook, take the nodes, review before exams. This creates the illusion of learning. You recognize concepts when you see term again. You feel productive while highlighting and rereading. Your brain mistakes this recognition for understanding. But recognition fades in 48 hours. And when you need to apply that knowledge to it or to a reference book in a meeting, an interview, a real problem, the illusion shatters. You realize you never actually learned it. You just borrowed someone else's understanding temporarily. This is WH you forget everything you read to it in a week. This is WH you can't explain concepts you think you know. This is WH credentials don't guarantee competence. The conventional method creates intellectual dependence. You need the textbook. You need the lecture slides. You need to Google it. You're never free from the source because you never build the understanding yourself. You're renting knowledge, not owning it. Feynman did the opposite. He refused to copy. He refused to highlight. He refused to passively absorb. Instead, he reads and structured everything from scratch in his notebooks. This forced his brain to build understanding rather than borrow it. The difference is brutal. One creates dependence on external sources. The other creates independent thought. One produces temporary familiarity. The other permanent infrastructure. As he later explained in his Nobel acceptance speech, I learned very early the difference between knowing the name of something and knowing something. The notebooks were where he learned the something. Everything else was just names. But understanding how this worked requires seeing what he actually did in those 47 notebooks. Because this wasn't about having better handwriting or prettier formatting. This was about transforming the notebook from a passive storage device into an active thinking tool. And the transformation happened through our specific principles that schools never taught. Caltech 1960-S. Файнбран kept a mental list later documented in chestnut books of 12 fundamental problems he found beautiful. As he described in Surely You're Joking, me. Feinberg whenever he encountered new information he didn't ask is this interesting, he asked does this connect to one of the 12 problems, if yes he wrote it down and explored the connection, if no he ignored it completely when a кролика casually maintained superfluidity at launch mundane fidelity as random trivia, immediately connected it to problem 7 on chess list. WH do particles behave differently in groups within 3 weeks chestnut book contains 17 pages of new theories about quantum liquid behavior. All sparked by that single filter question. The 12 problems weren't random. They were carefully chosen associations that defined each as intellectual identity. Some were broad. What is the relationship between mathematics and physics? Others were specific. WH does helium become a superfluid at low temperatures? But they all shared one quality. They were problems he genuinely couldn't stop thinking about. The list wasn't about being comprehensive. It was about being honest about what actually fascinated him. While most people consume information reactively, reading whatever person fits, course, or books, Feynman consumed actively through this filter. The notebooks weren't just storage. They were battlegrounds where information had to prove relevance to existing associations. This created two massive advantages. First, everything he learned had immediate context, making it stick naturally without forced memorization. Second, he avoided information overload because 95% of incoming noise failed the filter test. It was irrelevant to just 12 problems, so it never entered each system. But WHO did this work when conventional not attacking failed. The cognitive principle is brutal in its simplicity. Your brain can't retain information without connection points. When you passively consume random facts, your brain has nowhere to store them. They float disconnected, vulnerable to immediate forgetting. But when you filter everything through 12 core problems, every new piece of information arrives with built-in connections. It's not random. It's substitution for an existing association. The filter wasn't about being narrow. It was about building a knowledge immune system that rejects noise and amplifies signal. This wasn't just about physics problems. It was about building deliberate intellectual infrastructure instead of letting random inputs control your attention. Feynman's notebooks reveal something schools never teach. The goal isn't to learn everything. The goal is to build weaponized knowledge around specific targets. The same principle applies today when you're drowning in online course, podcasts, newsletters, and LinkedIn thought leadership. Before consuming anything, define your personal 12 problems. The core questions your career, projects, or genuine curiosity revolve around. When you encounter information, ask Feynman's filter question. Which of my 12 problems does this solve? If none, delete it. No guilt, no FOMO. If yes, capture it in your system, whether it has Notion, Obsidian, or paper, and immediately explore how it connects. You're not learning everything. You're building a targeted arsenal, the modern equivalent. Your 12 problems become your personal algorithm that pre-filters information before your attention gets hijacked by whatever platform wants to monetize your focus. But the filter was just step 1. What Feynman did with information that passed the filter was even more radical. MIT 1939. Professor Maur's assigned advanced calculus reading. Feynman's classmates dutifully copy textbook solutions into their notes, highlighting steps in yellow. Feynman opens each black marble notebook, blank pages staring back. He reads the problem once, closes the book, Tiener tempetes to solve it from scratch. She fails. The algebra breaks down. He tries again with a different approach. Fails again. On the fourth attempt, 6 hours later, he there is a solution, but it looks completely different from the textbook approach. Each method is 3 times longer, usi sunt conventional notation, and arrives at the same answer through a path nobody else took. He then opens the textbook and compares. Each method revealed 3 hidden assumptions the textbook glossed over. It possessed 2 alternative solution paths the book never mentioned. It forced him to understand which certain steps worked. Not just that they worked, the textbook gave him the destination. Each notebook gave him the map of the entire territory. Years later, this habit produced each path integral formulation of quantum mechanics. A completely original reversion of existing physics that nobody else had seen because everyone else just studied the standard textbook versions by Dirac and Heisenberg. They learned physics. Feynman rebuilt it. While authors treated the textbook as the destination, copy it, memorize it, regurgitate it. Feynman treated it as mere validation for each spontaneity. The cognitive difference is brutal. When you copy, your brain experiences recognition. Yes, this looks familiar. When you derive from scratch, your brain experiences construction. I built this. Recognition fades in 48 hours. Construction becomes permanent mental infrastructure. Feynman's notebooks weren't filled with copied formulas. They were filled with filtered MPTs, crossouts, dead ends, and eventual breakthroughs. Evidence of cognitive work. This isn't about physics. It was about forcing the brain to build instead of borrow. Each return was mental weightlifting. Each copied formula was mental atrophy. As he explained in What Do You Care? What other people think? I don't know what's the matter with people. They don't learn by understanding. They learn by some other way by rote or something. Their knowledge is so fragile. To understand which this matters, fast forward to Los Alamos 1943. The Manhattan Project needs classified physics recalculated. Security protocols forbid accessing certain documents without clearance. Feynman sits down with blank paper. He doesn't consult each on classified nodes from previous work. Instead, he retrieves everything from first principles, particle behavior, energy calculations, chain reaction mathematics. He finishes in 3 days. Colleagues using reference books take 2 weeks. Security officers are suspicious. How does he know this without reading the classified material? Each answer reveals everything. I drive the IT. He didn't need to remember it because he never memorized it in the first place. He understood the principle so deeply that reconstruction was faster than memory. The principle wasn't about showing off. It was about independence. When you copy, you're permanently tethered to the source. When you derive, you become your own source. The notebook method transformed Feynman from someone who knew physics into someone who could rebuild physics on demand. When you're learning to code, don't just follow tutorials step by step. Read the tutorial once, close it, and try rebuilding the project from memory. You fail initially, exactly like Feynman did with calculus at MIT. That failure is where learning lives. Each error possesses a gap between recognition and understanding. When you're studying finance, don't highlight Simeone's valuation model. Close the book and try building your own from first principles. When it breaks, compare it to the expert's version. The differences reveal what you don't actually understand. Modern trap. Tutorial hill, where you can build knitting while following instructions, but not when the tutorial ends. Modern solution. The Feynman return cycle. Read once, close source, reconstruct, fail, compare, identify gaps, repeat. It's slow initially, but you're building permanent understanding instead of temporary familiarity. But there was a third principle that turned notebooks into lie detectors for fake knowledge. Caltech, 1961. Feynman agrees to teach freshman physics, a course most Nobel laureates consider being a term. But he has a rule meticulously documented in each notebooks. Every concept must be explainable to someone who knows absolutely nothing. He spends 3 weeks preparing the first lecture on forces. Each notebook shows 17 different attempts to explain Newton's laws with or jargon. Each draft gets simpler. Version 1 technically accurate, abstractly correct, completely incomprehensible to anyone with or a physics degree. Version 17. Push something, it pushes back. That's all forces. This standard, later called the Feynman technique by educators, came directly from each notebooks. If he couldn't explain it simply, she didn't understand it. The technique isn't pedagogy. It was each's personal lie detector for fake knowledge. The contrast with each's colleagues was stark. Murray Gell-Mann could dazzle audiences with sophisticated vocabulary and complex frameworks. But when pressed to simplify, the explanation collapsed into jargon. Feynman knew immediately. Gell-Mann had borrowed the understanding from somewhere else. When Feynman could teach quantum electronomics to freshmen, he knew mastered it at a level where even jargon became optional. While most experts demonstrate knowledge through a complexity, technical terminology, sophisticated frameworks, impressive vocabulary, Feynman tested knowledge through a simplification. The cognitive principle, complexity hides gaps. Simplicity passes term. If you can't explain something simply, it means your understanding is either incomplete or averent on borrowed terminology. You're using fancy words as a crutch because the actual understanding isn't there. Feynman's notebooks forced brutal honesty. He wrote explanations for an imaginary freshman with no background. When sentences became complicated, he circled them and rewrote. Each simplification revealed an assumption he hadn't examined or a concept he didn't truly grasp himself. This isn't about dumbing down. It was about building understanding. So solid, it didn't need jargon as armor. The notebook became a mirror, showing him exactly where each thinking was clear and where it was faking clarity through vocabulary. Before any presentation, interview, or major decision, open a blank document and explain your idea as if teaching a smart 12-year-old. If you need technical jargon to make it work, you don't understand it yet. You will just memorize someone else's explanation. When preparing for technical interviews, explain the algorithm to an imaginary friend who codes but doesn't know this specific algorithm. Gaps will appear immediately. When pitching a business idea, explain it to it or to think industry buzzwords like synergy or disruption. If it collapses with or those words, you're selling vocabulary, not value. Modern application. Before posting that LinkedIn thought leadership piece, try explaining it to a friend outside your industry over coffee. If they're confused, your understanding is borrowed, not built. But there was one more principle that made the notebooks work, something most people miss entirely. Los Alamos 1945. A colleague who asks Feynman WJ, he doesn't just solve problems mentally. After all, is clearly capable of intense mental calculation. Find Mrnopinsich's notebook and points to a page filled with crossed out equations and revisited MPTS. When it's all in my head, he explained in a later interview, I can lie to myself about whether something works. On paper, the method doesn't let me cheat. He described internal thinking as inherently messy, full of well-formed ideas, hidden contradictions, and logical dead that mental thought alone solved untangle. The notebook isn't storage. It was a debugger for faulty logic. Years later, during the Challenger investigation in 1986, he insisted on writing everything down during NASA testimony. While other core missions relied on memory and consensus, each notebook caught the contradictions between what officials claimed and what the data showed. Everyone else heard the same testimony. Only Feynman's notebook revealed the inconsistencies because only Feynman externalized the information where contradictions became visible. While most people see writing as a way to record finished thoughts, Feynman said writing to build thoughts. The difference in internal thought is fast but sloppy. Your brain skips steps, makes unjustified assumptions, and experiences confirmation without noticing. External thought on paper is slow but honest. You can skip steps because they are visible. You can't hide assumptions because they are written down. The physical act forced accountability. This isn't about pen versus keyboard. It was about externalizing cognition so you could examine it like a scientist examines data. The notebook transformed thinking from an invisible, unreliable process into a visible, debuggable one. Each written line was a hypothesis. Each crossword was a falsified claim. The page became a laboratory for idea square but logic solved had behind mental speed. The principle of externalizing thought for debugging works identically today whether you use paper or notion. When solving complex problems, write out your thinking step by step in a document. Don't just write the conclusion, write the reasoning chain. Seeing it externalized immediately reveals logical leaps, hidden assumptions, or circular reasoning you'd miss entirely in your head. When making important decisions, write out your complete case for each option. The act of articulating forces clarity that mental rumination never achieves. Modern trap. It just think it through. Modern solution force externalization. Notion, Obsidian, Google Docs or Paper. The medium doesn't matter. What matters is converting invisible thought into visible logic you can debug. Exactly like Feynman did in 47 notebooks. When you combine the 12 problems filter, the derived and copy principle, the explain simple test, and the physical externalization method, you get something schools never teach, independent thought infrastructure. This is W.J. Feynman won the Nobel Prize in 1965. Not because he was born with a higher IQ than his colleagues, but because his notebooks transformed him into a thinking machine that didn't need external validation to verify understanding. While authors needed textbooks to confirm they were right, Feynman's notebooks made him choose on verification system. While authors needed credentials to prove competence, Feynman's ability to explain complex physics to freshmen became the credential itself. But the deeper revelation isn't about physics or Nobel Prizes. It's about liberation from intellectual dependence. Every copied note, every highlighted sentence, every possibly consumed lecture keeps you reliant on someone else's understanding. You're borrowing their way of seeing the world, their way of solving problems, their way of thinking. Feynman's method, brutal, slow, frustrating at first, builds cognitive sovereignty. You're not learning what others think. You're learning how to think. The notebook isn't a tool for storing information. It was a declaration of independence from the educational system's most profitable lie. That knowledge is something you receive rather than something you build. As Feynman said in Questionable Lecture in Stockholm, I learned very early the difference between knowing the name of something and knowing something. The notebooks were where he learned the something. Everything else was just names. Impressive vocabulary masking borrowed understanding. This is the generous the system deliberately hides. You don't need their names, their credentials, their textbooks, their course. You need their method. And the method is simple. Reconstruct everything from scratch until you can explain it to someone who knows nothing. The notebooks were just the battlefield. The real war was against borrowed understanding. The difference between Feynman and teachers equally среди интеллект asntinei talent. It was method. One group consumed knowledge. Feynman constructed it. One group could pass tests. Feynman could rebuild entire fields of physics from memory. One group needed the system. Feynman became independent of it. The next time you open a course, a textbook or a tutorial, remember MIT 1939. Remember the freshman who refused to copy while 200 classmates frantically scribbled no DS. Remember the 47 notebooks filled not with otropopous ideas, but with each on reconstructions, failures, and breakthroughs. The difference between memorizing and mastering isn't talent or IQ. It's method. And the method is brutally simple. Close the source, open a blank page, and force yourself to rebuild what you just learned from absolutely nothing. It will feel impossible at first. Your returns will fail. Your explanations will collapse into confusion. You'll be tempted to pick at the textbook to copy just this one formula to highlight instead of reconstruct. That temptation is your brain trying to stay dependent. The difficulty isn't a book in the system. It's the feature. The struggle is where independence gets built. Feynman didn't become a genius because of notebooks. He revealed its capacity for systematic thought by using term correctly. The same capacity exists in you. It's not about being smarter. It's about being more honest with yourself. About the difference between recognition and understanding, between borrowed knowledge and built knowledge, between dependence and sovereignty. The question isn't whether you're smart enough. The question is whether you're willing to do what schools never taught you. Stop borrowing understanding and start building it one reconstructed concept at a time. But this method was just one piece. Feynman said another technique, what he called the problem of productivity, or that most people get completely wrong about how curiosity actually works. Thus, notebook method showed you how to build understanding. The Dort method showed you which understanding was worth building in the first place.